framing the topic, sort of setting the stage, and we're going to hear from Daryl Chansuthus, Executive Director of WRAP, W-R-A-P, and Daryl will tell us a little bit about WRAP and then talk about this important issue that we're talking about today. Daryl?
Good afternoon, and I'd like to thank the mayor for sharing a bit of his personal story, because it, I think, paves the way nicely for the stories I'd like to begin with this morning. Starting with Sarah. Sarah shook as she walked through the doors of WRAP, leaning on the arm of the gentle and caring police officer who brought her to us from the hospital. She was emaciated. Her bones poked out through her clothes. She had a black eye and bruises on her arms and legs. She had what felt like 100 knots on her head where it had been banged repeatedly on the floor. She was confused and disoriented. She was frightened. She was 50 and middle class with a bachelor's degree and had been married for 21 years to a man 10 years her senior, who had become increasingly abusive over the years, isolating her from family and friends, limiting her access to money and transportation, verbally and physically abusing her, neglecting her, and starving her. She whispered to me, with eyes that were wide and round with fear, "This morning, I looked at myself in the mirror. I saw my bruises, I saw my bones, and I told myself, Sarah, you're gonna die if you don't get out of here." And so I left. Even then, broken, battered, and bruised as she was, she still couldn't bring herself to utter the awful words that her husband, the person she had loved and trusted, had abused her. James was quiet and withdrawn when he came to our shelter. He was only 11, but his eyes spoke of a century of pain. They were a bottomless brown, searching and deeply wounded. His mother was wild-eyed and frantic, trembling with her fear, unable to speak more than a few words without crying. She was running from her husband of 13 years. He had been arrested for assaulting her and threatening their son, who had tried to intervene. But he had made bail. He was looking for her. He was mad. She knew he was going to kill her, and possibly even their child. She knew no one could or would protect her. And so she did the only thing she could do. She ran. Brian had served several tours in the Middle East and had held his only friend in his arms as his friend died in the field from enemy fire. Brian was under 30 when he came to us. A victim of child sexual abuse and a graduate of foster care, Brian had joined the military in search of some stability and structure, and because there was nowhere else to go. He came home burdened with grief and PTSD, the result of the loss of his friend, his only friend, the violence he had experienced in service, and the violence that had been inflicted upon him when he was a child. He had no family. He had no friends. He had no place to go and no one who cared. He was aching inside, but he didn't know what to do about it. He didn't really think anything could be done about it. So he got himself an hourly paid job, secured a modest place to live, and found Mary. Mary had experienced domestic and sexual violence as a child too. But she dealt with her pain by inflicting pain on Brian. Because he had no one else, Brian suffered this abuse in silence. It was only when Mary left him, without money or place to live, that he came to us in a desperate search for help. He was teetering on the edge and was afraid he was going to fall, and was afraid no one would understand, because he was a man. Lisa sat in the witness room in court and listened quietly as the advocate shared with her the services that were available to help her and her 6 children. This was the 4th time she had been in court because her husband had battered her. The drill was the same. Her husband would get drunk, come home and beat her up. The neighbors would hear and report the abuse. The police would come and find Lisa battered and bleeding and the children cowering. They would arrest her husband at his hearing. She might or might not appear, but she would always refuse to press charges. She would refuse to cooperate, and then she would return home with her batterer. On this day in court, her face blue and purple from the abuse, she looked at the advocates without expression and told them, "I want to leave him. I don't want to be beaten. But what am I going to do alone out there with 6 kids? I don't have a high school degree. I ain't never worked a day in my life except to take care of my kids in my house. Who's going to feed my kids? Where are we going to stay? Who's going to keep us safe from him for as long as it takes? No, I'll stay. That beating is just the price I got to pay to make sure my kids have a house, clothes to wear, and food to eat." These are but a few of the almost 2,000 survivors of domestic violence whom RAP advocates helped in 14 counties in West Tennessee in 2012, providing court advocacy, hospital accompaniment, shelter, counseling, case management, resource linkage, support groups, transitional housing, and transportation services. On just one day in 2012, agencies like RAP throughout Tennessee provided services just like these to 768 victims of domestic or sexual violence on just one day. In the 9 counties that comprise Northwest Tennessee, according to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation Crime Statistics for 2012, there were, just at sheriff's departments, not including the police, there were 648 reported cases of domestic violence. Several of those offenses most likely involved more than one victim, since the majority, according to another 2012 TBI study, were offenses against women. Many of the domestic violence victims with whom RAP advocates work have 1 or more minor children. If we assume that only half of the 648 victims of domestic violence in Northwest Tennessee were women with at least 1 minor child, those 648 domestic violence cases potentially involve a minimum of 972 victims, just for those reported with the sheriff's departments. And these are just the victims of the reported crimes of domestic violence. According to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence is one of the most chronically underreported crimes, with only 1/4 of all physical assaults, 1/5 of all rapes, and 1/2 of all stalkings being reported to the police. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, in their 2010 National Survey on Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence, estimated that about 4 out of every 10 females and 3 out of every 10 males in Tennessee had experienced rape, physical violence, and/or stalking by an intimate partner at some point in their lives. The CDC has identified this sort of violence as a serious public health problem in the United States, with the 2010 survey revealing that those who had reported a history of sexual or domestic violence had experienced poorer health outcomes than those who had reported no such abuse. Domestic violence is, in fact, a problem that leaves permanent physical and emotional scars, and that erodes communities by reducing productivity and disrupting social services. Although domestic violence usually occurs within the home, many victims are also employed and spend a good bit of their time on the job. Thus, domestic violence has a variety of repercussions for the workplace. An early study conducted by the Department of Justice found that domestic violence victims experience impaired work performance and require more time off than employees who are not abused. These victims were also found to be more likely to experience such emotional problems as depression, anxiety, and low self-esteem, all of which can and do have a negative impact on productivity. The 2010 CDC survey confirmed the mental health findings of this study and also found that employees with a history of domestic or sexual violence tend to experience poor health outcomes overall, and thus tend to have higher health care costs than persons who have no history of domestic or sexual violence. On average, a domestic violence victim incurs $1,775 more in annual medical costs than an individual who is not a victim. Earlier this year, at one of the hearings, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Tennessee's Health Institute estimated that domestic violence alone costs commercial health insurance members an additional $7 per member per month in higher premiums and has had comparable impact on Medicaid costs, which, to translate that, results in a family of 4, for example, paying up to an additional $28 each month in health insurance premiums due to the existence and ripple effect of domestic violence. Another early study conducted by the CDC showed that in 1995, the cost of intimate partner violence against women alone exceeded an estimated $5.8 billion. When updated to 2003 dollars, intimate partner violence costs to the U.S. economy in terms of medical care, mental health costs, and lost productivity exceeded $8.3 billion. And that was in 2003. I couldn't find any more recent numbers than that, but I can only imagine that it's probably almost doubled by now. And that is a significant underestimate because it does not include legal and court costs or the cost of such public and private social services as child welfare and domestic violence programs. The increased annual health care costs for victims of intimate partner violence can persist, as the mayor pointed out earlier, as much as 15 years after the cessation of abuse. And victims of severe intimate partner violence lose nearly 8 million days of paid work, the equivalent of more than 32,000 full-time jobs and almost 5.6 million days of household productivity a year. Finally, women who have experienced severe aggression by men, for example, by not being allowed to go to work or to school, or by having their lives or their children's lives threatened, are more likely to have been unemployed in the past, like Lisa, have health problems, and be receiving public assistance. Domestic violence crimes are reported as and generally considered to be crimes against a person. And they are, for sure, crimes against a person. But as we have also seen, domestic violence is not just a crime against a person. Domestic violence impacts the women, men, children, and systems directly involved, as well as a wide range of people and systems indirectly involved. Given this, these crimes are crimes against our entire community. And the entire community must take responsibility for ending this devastating public health and safety issue that affects us all. Domestic violence crosses the boundaries of race, ethnicity, class, socioeconomic status, religion, language, and nationality. If we are to succeed in ending it, we must view it as a human rights issue and create the norm in our communities that we expect everyone to be safe. And we must initiate actions that clearly demonstrate our commitment to safety and justice for victims of domestic violence and to violence-free communities. What might those actions look like? Well, we could, for example, support a region-wide long-term campaign to shift social norms so that domestic and sexual violence is no longer tolerated in our communities. We could create common messages articulating that domestic violence is a violation of human rights, a serious public health problem, and a threat to public health and safety in the workplace. We could establish policies and programs within our school districts and among our employers that provide resources and education to create school and work environments that exemplify and support healthy, violence-free relationships for students or employees and their families. We could also strengthen our enforcement of current laws and identify and/or institute incentives, core competencies, and resources for legal, law enforcement, health, mental health, and social service professionals to promote and sustain the prevention, identification, and intervention of family violence. Finally, we could strengthen our systems by identifying service gaps and maximizing the use of resources through interagency and public-private sector collaboration. What's important is that we stop thinking about domestic violence as only a crime against a person and not related to us, but that we start thinking about it as a crime against us all, a crime that we can, if we are willing to work wholeheartedly together, absolutely do something about. As Nobel laureate Nelson Mandela explained, safety and security don't just happen. They are the result of collective consensus and public investment. We owe our children, the most vulnerable citizens in our society, and truly the victims of the innocent victims of domestic violence, a life free of violence and fear. Thank you.
We may have some questions for you, Daryl. We will wait till all three in this session. Thank you.